This is The Current on CBC Radio 1 and Sirius XM. I'm Anna Maria Tremonti. Well, it was days of gunfire, and today the New York Times is reporting the attack on shoppers in a Nairobi shopping mall had been worked on for weeks or months ahead of time. Al-Shabaab, the Somali-based militant group with ties to al-Qaeda, of course, claimed responsibility for that. Somalia and its neighbors have tried to contain al-Shabaab, and in fact, Kenya managed to push it out of its base, but it retains some control in rural parts of Somalia. Al-Shabaab is a harsh master when it rules. It bans sports and music. Thieves face amputation. Women are lashed if they uncover their faces. My next guest believes it didn't have to be this way. In fact, he says 6 years ago, the West, Canada included, had a golden opportunity to push al-Shabaab to the margins. Abdi Samatar is the president of the African Studies Association and a geography professor at the University of Minnesota. He was born and raised in Somalia. He returns a few times a year, and Abdi Samatar is in Minneapolis. Good morning.
Good morning to you, Anne-Marie.
What was the opportunity we missed?
I think in 2006, there was a slow movement in the capital city of Mogadishu, where some religious people and the local populations were so fed up by the terror which was imposed on them by the warlords who have run that country for 16 years at that point in time. And through that mobilization, there was a public civic movement to push the warlords out. And they were quite successful. I was there at the time. The warlords who had literally decimated public life all of a sudden were on the run. And so something called the Union of the Islamic Courts was formed at that point in time. And I actually was moving back and forth between the United States and Somalia at that point in time, and I tried to convince my government here in the United States, at least the people I was able to talk with, that this is an interesting opportunity, and therefore I urged my government here in the United States to engage seriously with those people. That was the opportunity that was missed.
I remember the Union of Islamic Courts, but who was it made up of?
It was made of a large number of people who were quite diverse. There were some elements in that we will think of al-Shabaab today, quite radical in the least progressive way possible. But the majority of them were mostly religious folks who ran petty little courts in the absence of government in that country for the previous 16 years, and who did not have a great deal of experience in terms of running a government. And so, in my estimation, and I met with a significant proportion of their leadership, and what I sensed at that point in time was that these were people who were genuinely interested in peace, genuinely interested in the reconstruction of the country, but who had no clue whatsoever about how to proceed forward.
Okay, but they did run the shuras, the councils, and they were following a Sharia law. Am I correct?
That's correct, but you have to see this is a country for 16 years in which most people had not known what a government was like. There was no constitution, there was no public service, there were no ministries or community organizations of the kind that you and I take for granted every day. And so most of the people were Muslims, as they are now, and that's the only thing they knew, so they have to start from there. And so the question for me was, there are a variety of interpretations of the Sharia, all of them Islamic. And so which one they took became quite important. And so I thought this was a budding seedling on the ground that needed to be nourished, and then isolate the small fragments of those folks who you and I would not want to associate with. In fact, Anne-Marie, they asked me when I was in Mogadishu in June of that year, 2006, if I could help them communicate with the international community. So I said, I'm a professor, I'm not a politician or a diplomat, so I can't really do that. But I will be happy to assist you in any way I can. So I remember, one of the letters they wrote to the United Nations and the U.S. government to reach out to them. And of course, that fell on deaf ears. President Bush, I remember, spoke from his ranch in Crawford, Texas, 2-3 weeks after Mogadishu was cleaned of the warlords. And he said, we have a terrorist group that has taken over Somalia and we have to deal with them.
Well, there were stories in the Islamic courts banning soccer, threatening to execute people who broadcast the World Cup. There were stories that made people worry about what some of these leaders were doing.
Well, there's sort of two sides to that story. One side is There is no national security force. There are no court systems. There is no administration whatsoever. And so you get all of this coalition, and there are individuals in that coalition who are quite unsavory in anyone's books. And so rather than a decision being made at the center in the Shura, which said we will not allow people to watch the soccer World Cup, we will not allow people to have parties in their weddings. Individual agents who were in certain kinds of neighborhoods began to act on their own.
So they were rogue, in other words, you're saying?
They were sort of a rogue individuals who were doing those sort of things. But the tragedy is that the New York Times, for instance, among other places, picked up on this and said, this is the new face of Somalia.
What happened after Ethiopia invaded Somalia and pushed out the Islamic courts?
I mean, here is the sort of a strategic mistakes that were made. Ethiopia drove into Mogadishu in a Muslim country on Christmas Day 2006. This is quite symbolic. This is the kind of a crazy ideas that rogue communities like al-Shabaab, for instance, latched on and said, the Christians are coming, they are here on Christmas Day. So regardless of that, they came and then they devastated the city.
Is that where al-Shabaab starts to gain influence?
Once the Ethiopians began to occupy and devastate, people began to resist. The resistance was fragmented originally. For the first 3 months, there were a few hits and misses. And then elements of the certain segments of what used to be the militias of the Union of the Islamic Courts began to take the Ethiopians front on and began to make a name for themselves.
So you're telling me that because of the Western fear of the Islamic courts, because of the Western fear of the sort of the Islam in that phrase, that the reaction actually spurred a more radical Islamic group to go further.
I am quite certain that the way what we know al-Shabaab began to get traction from thereafter.
Abdi Samatar, thank you for your thoughts today.
With pleasure, Anne-Marie.
Abdi Samatar is the president of the African Studies Association, born and raised in Somalia, now teaching geography at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. Well, there's a disagreement about whether and how to engage with Islamist political groups. And for the purposes of this discussion, we should make a distinction between groups whose politics are shaped by religious beliefs and jihadist groups which refuse to participate in electoral politics and use their beliefs to justify their violence. So for their thoughts on who Western nations should be working with and how, we're joined by two people. Adnan Khan is a Canadian journalist who's normally based in southern Turkey. He's with me in Toronto this morning. And Zuhdi Jasser is the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Zuhdi Jasser is in Phoenix, Arizona. Good morning to you both.
Good morning, Anna Maria.
Adnan Khan. Oh, good, you're there. Adnan Khan, let's begin with you. What's the case for engaging with Islamist groups? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that was an important distinction that you made early on, with the distinction between groups that are willing to engage in the political process and groups that are not. We have a situation in many Islamic countries, particularly in the Middle East, where there's a political consciousness that's coming, democratic consciousness that's in its early stages. Now, if we don't engage certain groups that want to join that process because of an ideology that we perhaps find a little bit difficult to understand and accept from our perspective, then I think we stunt that whole process before it can even start. Now, I think that ultimately, if we look at a democratic process over time, all groups tend to moderate. And if we give an opportunity for Islamist groups, Islamist politics, they're a reality. If we give them the opportunity to engage, I think over time you'll see, and we have seen, a moderation of the ideology.
Well, Zuhdi Jasser, what's the case against engaging with those Islamist groups?
Well, the case against them is that there is no, it's a paradox to say, or an oxymoron to say there's a moderate Islamism. You have to get the definitions, as I see them, as a Muslim who's reforming against political Islam, or the sense of the domination of the Islamic Sharia state versus the secular state that separates mosque and state. And there is no way to have a moderate theocracy per se. They may be condemning violence. They may find themselves to use democracy where that's the way they ascend to power. But every example in history, from Iran to the Taliban, to any that have been engaged in the political system, it's a one-man, one-vote system, and there's no return. They believe in majoritocracy, not in pluralism. And the ideology itself, no different than during the Cold War, when we fought communism, Islamism, whether it's violent or non-violent, is not an ideology that could ever come to terms with Western principles of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because the way they see their people is that they don't get their rights from God, but rather through Islam and through the oligarchy of the scholars of Islam. And I think that ultimately, sure, on the ground, our military, the police should work with the more moderates that condemn violence. But when it comes to the imprimatur of America and the West, the Islamists already get global support from Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, from petrodollars all over. If we're going to support anyone, we need to help support the secularists on the ground that are trying to reform the majority, I believe, that don't want the Islamic State and want the nation state.
So are you saying, Zuhdi, that if the politics is based on the religious beliefs, it's automatically anti-democratic?
In many ways, yes, and that if the politics is based on the dream of the Islamic State, where the law comes from the ulama and the scholars believe in Sharia, it is not democratic. It is inspired by, look at Islamic organizations that run their law not based in reason but based in Sharia. That is not, people who are non-Muslim or non-Islamist don't have access to that legal system, and by definition, it's supremacist. I'm not talking about not bringing their faith to politics. I'm talking about a state that's inspired by a legal system based in Sharia, where the ulama or the scholars define what is law and what is not.
Adnan Khan, you want to get in there?
Yeah, well, I think there's a mixing up of terminology here. I think, if you have, for example, the Taliban or in Iran, there's never really been an engagement of Islamist or, let's say, Islamic political groups in a democratic system. I don't think the Taliban were never involved in any sort of democratic process, nor was there ever a real democratic process in Iran. I think the better example is Turkey. In Turkey, we've seen over the last 60 years, 80 years of its history, we've seen a very strong sort of rejection of Islamic principles, except in the last 10 years, or Islam within politics. Now, what we've seen in the Turkish example is an Islamic political movement that was around a long time before the early 2000s, and we've seen it develop. In the early days, in the late 1990s, there was the Erbakan movement, which was very strongly Islamist, much more strongly in terms of Sharia, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we've seen over the last 10 years with the AKP, the current Turkish leadership, with an Islamist government that's engaged in politics, that's working within the context of a political system and having to make compromises. Now, of course, the success of their governance over the last 10 years, of course, comes into question. But ultimately, the engagement is what's important.
Well, let me pick up on that. Zuhdi Jasser, if you push the Islamist political groups to the margins, wouldn't you expect them then to develop radical arms?
Absolutely, and I agree with that. I'm not saying to make them illegal. Egypt is another example.
But if you don't engage, but even if you don't make them illegal, if you don't engage them on another level.
Well, they're being engaged, facilitated by tons of a number of global interests from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, from Saudi, from UAE, from Qatar, which promotes Islamists on their Al Jazeera network and others. If we in America, if we look at our own interests and the interests of freedom, why do we need to engage ideologies that are an anathema to the West? We should engage the groups that are the majority, as if we look at Muslim world citizenry as if the secularist, liberal, democratic organizations do not exist. And they do. So I think we should take sides and say, well, the Islamists, they're free to exist. We shouldn't make them illegal, which actually fuels them and makes them into martyrs, but rather help the other side and help the Muslims that believe in the separation of mosque and states, the women's movements, the pluralistic movements, the non-Islamist groups. Why not take sides and make them relevant and not make it appear that there's only two sides in every one of these countries where Muslims are stuck between a choice between national fascism and Islamism? And I think there is a third path, or those groups based in liberalism.
Well, just to respond to that, I think that attempt has already been made. The U.S. Support, for example, of the FSA in Syria, the support of the Mubarak regime, which was an absolute failure in Egypt. I think those attempts to engage with this so-called liberal movements, secular movements in places like Egypt and in other parts of the Muslim world. We've seen an abject failure, quite frankly, in that policy now. What we haven't seen is an attempt to say, okay, well, in Egypt, we have an election that actually brought in an Islamist government, a free and fair election. Now, the way they governed is a different issue, and that's up to the Egyptian people to decide if they're happy with that sort of governance or not. But what we should be doing, I think, from our perspective is, listen, there's a political process that's growing and that's developing in this part of the world. And in fact, if you look in Egypt and if you look at the liberal secularist movement, the April 6th movement, for example, they've embraced the idea that, listen, we need to engage with our Islamist brothers in that sense, in the political sense.
I could not disagree more about Egypt. We did not engage the moderate population. The masses revolted against Mubarak, and then the Brotherhood came to power, and we actually engaged them, facilitated them, and then even bigger masses revolted again against the Brotherhood, and that showed that the people of Egypt wanted neither of the fascisms, and we actually stayed in the side. President Obama said we should not take sides, and to say that we've helped liberals on the ground defies every reformist I've talked to, from Morocco to Egypt to Syria. We have, till today, have yet to help the secularists in Syria and have allowed Syria to be radicalized into al-Qaeda and Islamists being supported to the billions by Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Gentlemen, I was hoping you could convince each other. It's not going to happen, and we're out of time, so we have to leave it there. But thank you both for your perspectives on this. Makes the rest of us think. Adnan Khan is a Canadian journalist and a correspondent with Maclean's magazine. He was in our Toronto studio. Zuhdi Jasser is the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. He was in Phoenix, Arizona.